Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Andreas Bieler. I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice. And it's my privilege to conduct this brief interview with Adam Elliott-Cooper on especially his book of Black Resistance to British Policing. So Adam is a senior lecturer at the School of Politics and International Relations at the Queen Mary University of London. And as I mentioned, this book on Black resistance to British policing is quite path-breaking, but it's actually also very topical if you look at developments around policing in the UK at this point in time, perhaps also when you think about the protests against arms deliveries to Israel, and in solidarity with Palestinian people. So welcome, Adam. Thanks for joining us here for that interview. It's great to have you with us. So let's start off. And that goes right to the heart of your book. How would you respond to people who argue that racism in the Britain started when people were suddenly confronted with many non-white people during the 1950s? There was the Windrush generation, people coming from the Caribbean, and people said, oh, well, then suddenly people felt this otherness, and that's when racism started. What would be your response to that?
I think it's useful to think about British racism as something which doesn't arrive on the shores of Britain during the post-war period of mass migration, but rather a project which Britain has exported to the rest of the world through colonization. Britain was founded in 1707 not as a nation state, but as an imperial state. And as an imperial state, it was competing with other European nations to have the most profitable, expansive, militaristically powerful, and ideological empire. But rationalizing and justifying that exploitation, that violence of chattel slavery or genocide or colonial domination needed to be rationalized and justified in an era of Enlightenment thinking, where ideas like freedom, liberty, rights, and justice became the dominant ways of understanding and organizing European societies. And so race played this really important role, not just in categorizing different workers across the empire differently in order to exploit them differently. Some were surplus and exterminated, some were enslaved, some were indentured, some were wage earners, right? Some were peasants, right? But also it played a crucial role in rationalizing this kind of domination because it enabled European colonial powers to simultaneously argue that they embodied the ideals and freedoms and liberties and ethics of the Enlightenment, while at the same time being able to distinguish between those for whom those who did not have the capacity to participate in that Enlightenment project. And so race plays this fundamental role in British political economy, in British government and British political philosophy, not from the middle of the 20th century as people from its colonies migrate to the British mainland in significant numbers, but rather as Britain expands across the rest of the world, colonizing almost a third of the planet and using race to both govern more effectively and rationalize that governance as well.
So very interesting, really. Then the racism we've experienced here in Britain is really the outcome, the result of racism having been a fundamental part of the British Empire from the very beginning. Yeah.
Precisely. Racism is historically constituted in this colonial context. And its legacies are still living with us today. Not the same colonialism, so not the same racism of the colonial period, but of course a racism informed by, shaped by those histories of colonization.
That's a very interesting point you're making there, because that brings me to my second question, Adam. Some people would argue, yes, you're right. There has been historically racism, and that has then come back to the British shore in the 1950s and onwards. But haven't we made a lot of progress in this respect? And people would refer, for example, to the Macpherson report in 1999, which concluded that the Metropolitan Police was beset by institutional racism. Is this not a sign of clear progress? Is this not a sign that we as a society in Britain move beyond this racism?
So I think the first thing to say is that the anti-racist movements, whether they be labour organisations, grassroots media, campaigns, cultural organisations, youth movements, street protest movements, bookshops, literary, intellectual interventions, have had a profoundly civilising effect on Britain. We have a rich anti-racist culture, a vibrant network of urban multicultures across this country, which I think has a profound effect, right? Particularly, of course, within working class urban conurbations, right? This is where we see anti-racism, I think, really live in this country. But to argue that it is in the most powerful institutions of Britain that we see anti-racism residing, I think requires us to go back to this history, but also think about how that history endures into the present. So if we understand racism as something which is economic, right? It's a way of exploiting people differently. And that, of course, continues today, particularly with the differential exploitation of migrants. If we think about it as something which is state-driven, right? Not simply the nation state in terms of the role of the government, but the role of imperial states who exploit, extract resources, engage in forms of militaristic invasion and incursion, and other forms of domination, then we can understand racism as not being something which can be eroded by the kinds of suggestions or recommendations of the Macpherson report, which follows racist killing of Stephen Lawrence in 1993, in which anti-racist education, accountability, procedures and policies, or diversity drives are going to address these issues. And perhaps some of the best evidence for this doesn't come out of the left in this country, or even the liberal centre. It comes out of the right. It is the right that has embraced diversity. We see this, of course, with the Conservative Party, right? Their leadership has more quote unquote diversity than many leftist organisations. We even see it with the Reform Party, right? The chair of the Reform Party is a Muslim man, right, from a relatively ordinary background in this country. But if we go back further into history, of course, we see that during periods of colonisation, indigenous or colonized peoples were often inaugurated or brought into positions of administration, policing, education, religious institutions, right? Sometimes even trained at Britain's top universities, right? And therefore, these notions of diversity and education aren't necessarily something new. What they instead do, I think, is create an illusion of progress. They, on the one hand, reduce racism to individual prejudice or stereotyping or thoughtlessness, while at the same time, therefore, obscuring the history of racism, obscuring the political economy and class aspects of racism, and crucially as well, framing the state not as the primary mechanism for reproducing racial hierarchy, but rather framing the state as the solution. And so by rethinking these three questions, history, political economy, and the state, not as the solutions, but actually keys to understanding the problem, I think we can actually radically reinterpret the way in which we understand anti-racism as something which lies in working class struggles from the bottom up, not state and political and capitalist initiatives led from the top down.
So if there is hope, it's really from the struggles from the bottom up, yeah, rather than from the top. And it reminds me a bit of the fact that there's this very different response to the Ukraine war on one hand, and to the genocide in Gaza on the other hand, yeah, where there's an outpour of support for Ukrainians, and that's all fine. But there's basically no support, no solidarity. If at all, there's actually support of Israel carrying out a genocide on the other hand. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's particularly interesting about the case of Ukraine is I think it's a perfect case study of the slipperiness and shifting terrain of racialization. Because in 2015, 2016, right, the political class, the political culture, national political culture in Britain was certainly very anti-Ukraine. Ukraine was the wrong type of migrants. Ukrainians were the wrong type of white. There was a huge wave of anti-Eastern European xenophobia and xeno-racism, of course, brought to a crescendo with the Brexit vote. And we see this kind of politics being played out on the streets, attacks on Polish and other Eastern European workers, particularly on construction sites. We see graffiti, we see images in the press, we see media reports, and of course we see political campaigning against Eastern Europeans. Then the geopolitical interests of Britain shift, and now it becomes politically expedient for actually Britain to now be supporting, in this case, Ukraine. And therefore, they begin to frame Eastern Europeans as actually being the good, the deserving migrants, those for whom we should be embracing. And so we see the different ways in which racism can be differently utilized by the same nation state in a course of a matter of years to serve different nationalist interests. On the one hand, the kind of parochial nationalism, which is anti-migrant sentiment and the anti-EU. And then a few years later, the kind of nationalism, which is about a more aggressive, assertive form of Western and NATO-led foreign policy.
Yeah. And that again goes right back to your point that really, if we rely on the state for anti-racist policies, yeah, then this is no hopeful way forward. Yeah, the state is more using a strategy to reassert itself. Yeah, and in a way also entrenching racism further within the institutional setup.
Precisely. And we can, of course, this is the same rule applies when we think about class struggle and the feminist movements and the movements of any oppressed peoples.
Yeah, very good. In your work, you also call for abolishing the police, and that is controversial, and people question that as a possible way forward. How would you respond to people who argue that this would result in a lack of safety for people who no longer would have any authority to turn to in instances of violence against them? Yeah.
So I think the movement to abolish the police isn't necessarily a demand to sack every police officer tomorrow and close every prison the next day. Rather, it identifies the fact that we have a society has been created which becomes increasingly reliant on the police and prison system to maintain any degree of safety and stability. But what it also observes is when we look at the prison population, what we see are not necessarily the most evil, terrible people in the world, but people who are more likely to have experienced unemployment or worker exploitation. They're more likely to have experienced border violence or insecure immigration status. They're more likely to have experienced mental health problems or other forms of psychiatric ill health. They're more likely to have experienced addiction problems. They're more likely to have experienced violence, gender-based violence, child abuse, other forms of interpersonal violence, state violence. They're more likely to have experienced homelessness or precarious housing. There are a whole wave of social issues which have been experienced by the people who now reside in the British or any prison system across the world. And when we look at the countries where there are the highest levels of safety or the lowest levels of harm, they're not the societies or countries or economies with the highest, where people live under the greatest threat of incarceration. They're the places that have the best access to employment and a degree of workers' rights. They're the place where people have better access to housing and healthcare and community infrastructure and green space and supports for survivors of various forms of violence and harm. And so the project of prison abolition is, on the one hand, arguably a gradual reformist project, which seeks to erode society's reliance on the police and prison system and empower community-led forms of infrastructure, which can make people less likely to come into contact with the police and prison system in the first place, while at the same time articulating a revolutionary vision, which posits that if we do want to make prisons obsolete, if we do want to get to this end goal of being able to abolish the prison as an institution, we need to radically transform the world. We need to radically transform our economic system to one where there is no exploitation, not just less. We need to radically transform our idea of democracy, in which there isn't just more democratic participation, but we have full democratic participation. We cannot simply understand it as being a system where we can erode the effects of forms of gender-based violence and what have you, but actually live in a world in which we've moved beyond the different forms of interpersonal violence that exist. And arguably this could be a utopian vision. But I think that the ever-growing and expansive forms of incarceration, policing, ordering, and militarism that we've seen over the past 30 or 40 years makes it incumbent upon us to envision a future that is utopian. And so through these reforms, which can take us closer to that vision, as well as the revolutionary potential, I think, of the philosophy of prison abolition, we're seeing young people in particular articulate a radical politics, which isn't just anti-racist, right? It's anti-capitalist, it's anti-imperialist, and it seeks to find liberation from exploitation and violence for all people.
Very good, Adam. I like that how you combine reformist steps to make it actually envisageable how it could go, but tied up with much more radical demands, which get us beyond our current system. And ultimately, that's the only way forward, really, to move towards a different, more just society. Now, when we look at of course, Black people, Black workers have always organized in resistance against racism and against exploitation, and the Black Lives Matter movement in particular had been around for some years, but it was suddenly in 2020, against the background of the murder of George Floyd in the United States, that we had that global eruption of a Black Lives Matter movement. And what I found was interesting is I was at the time in Finland, but people didn't just rally to say how terrible it is in the United States, but they actually started to look at their own society. So in Finland, they looked at Finnish society and said, in what way are actually non-white people systematically discriminated against in Finland? And what do we need to overcome that? Now, 2020, of course, that's now almost 5 years ago, that moment. How do you view that? What is the legacy of the Black Lives Matter movement?
I think maybe there are 2 or 3 key legacies of this movement. One of them, of course, we've discussed already, right? Which is the popularization of this political framework of abolitionism. Right?
Yeah.
I think this is a really important set of concepts for people to make sense of the world today, but also articulate a revolutionary vision, as well as a set of practical ideas relating to reform in our everyday or our immediate future. But the second thing I think that we've seen is a greater racial literacy, a better understanding of processes of colonization and how racism plays a fundamental role in it. And I think that's been particularly important in helping people to make sense of what is happening in historic Palestine today. The protest movements that now dominate the streets of cities like London and others are now those in solidarity with Palestine. And I don't see those as being wholly separate from the Black Lives Matter movements. Not simply because Black Lives Matter movements across the world were very outspoken in their support for Palestine, but crucially as well, the different ways in which forms of militarism, forms of racialization, different forms of exploitation are clearly linked. Parallels are being drawn here. And so I think we should understand, for me anyway, the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement in solidarity with Palestine, we should understand it as being a broad movement against racism against imperialism, as well as other forms of exploitation as well. And so I think these protest movements, which of course are much more youth-led than they've been in previous generations, are much more forthright in their articulation of anti-colonialism and anti-racism, perhaps than they were 10 years ago, is a really, really important legacy. And I think maybe the final legacy, right, in addition to thinking about Palestine and anti-racism, thinking about prison and police abolition and connecting it, of course, to militarism and other forms of state violence, is this historical literacy as well. Is this looking back at histories in places like Britain, in places across other parts of Europe, where there has been this colonial amnesia in many kinds of ways, particularly in the mainstream, and using this understanding of history, not just of domination, but of resistance as well, to inform contemporary struggles. And I think this is crucially important, not simply because these forms of domination are historically constituted, but I think because by grounding these struggles in histories of anti-colonialism, they necessitate a kind of internationalism, which I think is crucial for these movements. By grounding these anti-racist struggles in their histories of anti-colonialism, they better enable us to think internationally, to think globally about our struggles. And I think those thinking globally, thinking in this abolitionist way and connecting it to contemporary urgent struggles like those in Palestine are really important legacies of those Black Lives Matter protests of 2020.
Excellent, Adam. I think that's a very hopeful note to end this interview on. Many thanks for your interventions here. Best of luck with your future research. Yeah, we look forward to reading what you're going to produce on the basis of these ideas in the years to come. And so many thanks to you. Goodbye.
Thanks for having me. Take it.